Hey everyone, it's Parker again. I am now the proud owner of Final Fantasy VII. It's great. This game's like a son to me. I like this game so much, I'm gonna make it my whole personality now. I have an excuse to talk about Crisis Core now.
Final Fantasy is one of the most iconic video game franchises of all time. It revolutionized the RPG genre and has gained 16 mainline games in its 37-year-long runtime. And while the other games in the series are iconic and revolutionary in their own way, none of them compare to the original Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII was revolutionary for a lot of things. It was the first RPG to actually sell well outside of Japan. It was the series' first jump into 3D, and it was one of the first games to really focus on a story. The game is still relevant, even today, with new games, books, and merch releasing all the time, and still selling remarkably well. People who grew up with the game and people who are new still love playing and talking about the games. And I want to learn why.
And so, without further delay, I'm going to discuss the compilation of Final Fantasy VII and why it's so popular. Enjoy the video.
This all begins in 1986 when the Japanese video game company Squaresoft was going out of business. This was due to multiple failures to appeal to players of that era, so the company was under the impression that their next game would be their last. And that's why they called it that. Final Fantasy released on January 31st of 1987, and it was a huge success, becoming a worthy rival to the Dragon Quest games, which were the definitive RPG at that time. The game was such a massive hit that it single-handedly saved Squaresoft from bankruptcy. Over the course of years, the game would of course receive sequels, but Final Fantasy's kinda weird. The series is something called an anthology, which basically means that while the game shared similar traits like the Victory Team, Chocobo, and Moogle creatures, and all having a party member named Sid for some reason, they all have completely separated stories that don't relate to each other in any way unless specifically stated otherwise.
I have to say this because people who don't play the games aren't in the know and think that Final Fantasy VIII and VII are connected, which they're not.
Naturally, Final Fantasy would get translated and released all around the world, but wouldn't reach the same widespread appeal with overseas audiences. It is widely assumed that players overseas, especially the ones in the US, wanted arcade-style games rather than slow-paced RPGs. It was also probably because these games were so different than the games they were used to. Even so, Final Fantasy did pretty good outside of Japan, and no doubt thanks to their partnership with Nintendo that made Final Fantasy be considered one of the big franchises on the NES, like Mega Man and Castlevania before it. Though, because of the lower-than-expected sales of Final Fantasy, it got a strange release schedule, to say the least. Only certain games in the franchise got translated for overseas players. Final Fantasy I was of course released, but Final Fantasy II wasn't. But in order not to confuse players, they did release Final Fantasy II, but it was actually Final Fantasy IV. And then they would release Final Fantasy III, but it was actually Final Fantasy VI. You do not know how hard this was to figure out. For simplicity, I will be using the Japanese titles from now on. Anyway, at this time, Square was excited to release their next Final Fantasy game on the Nintendo 64, which was going to be the most powerful system on the market. They wanted to go all out with Final Fantasy VII. They wanted to make it as cinematic as possible, really to make the game feel like a movie. They had struggled previously with the data space constraints of the SNES cartridges when making Final Fantasy VI, but they trusted that Nintendo was going to go with the new industry standard of CDs. And if you watched my Nintendo video, you already know where this is going. Nintendo stuck to their guns and kept using cartridges, making every game developer mad. This was during gaming's big jump into 3D that only meant game file sizes were getting bigger and bigger. If a developer wanted to port their game from the PlayStation to the Nintendo 64, they had to remove loads of content to get it to work. Square wasn't happy with this, and couldn't realize their vision on Nintendo's hardware. They even for a short period of time considered making Final Fantasy VII for the Super Nintendo. But Sony came to Square and made a deal with them to put Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation instead of the Nintendo 64, emphasizing the CD's disc file sizes. And Square agreed. Final Fantasy VII released on January 31st of 1987 on the PlayStation, and quickly became the console's second most sold game. Now let's talk about the actual game.
Hold your horses, voiceover Parker. I have some things I need to discuss real quick. Before we start actually talking about Final Fantasy VII, to make the rest of the video easier so I don't have to explain characters every time, I'm going to discuss the important ones, and no, that doesn't include Johnny. No one likes Johnny. Alright, now I have a list of all the characters right here, and I am free to list them to you at a normal pace. Cloud, yes, that's his name. He's the main character, the one on the cover. He is an emo dork and was part of Shinra's Super Soldiers. Tifa's the one people like to look up for some reason. She is Cloud's childhood friend and assists with a team called Avalanche. Speaking of that, Barrett is the leader of the eco-terrorist group Avalanche. Can you tell this game released in the 90s? He has an adopted daughter named Marlene and a gun for an arm. Aerith is a flower girl who is the last of a race called the Ancients. She can speak to the planet and is pretty much assumed to be the love interest for Cloud. Red 13 is a dog, lion, gat thing who guards the town called Cosmo Canyon. Yuffie is a ninja who likes materia. Kate Sith is a gat robot thing. This game's weird. Sid Highwind is a spaceship pilot. Vincent is a Valentine. I mean, that's true. But that's not what I was going to say. Vincent is a vampire and was a Turk for Shinra. The Shinra Electric Power Company is a group of people that basically rule the planet. And Sephiroth is the main villain of the story. He is the strongest Shinra super soldier and went insane after learning his mother was an alien planet parasite and now wants to destroy the planet. Did I tell you this game has themes of pollution? Alright, and that should be everything, and I'm not forgetting anyone important. Everyone get that? Yeah? Okay, moving on.
The story follows Cloud when he joins the eco-terrorist group Avalanche to stop Shinra from killing the planet because they're using its life source like fossil fuels. Eventually, the story takes a more extravagant turn when Sephiroth basically says, "You remember what happened to the dinosaurs? I'ma do that." And the group tries to stop him. That's basically the whole game, but there are more themes of identity and masculinity, but they aren't really that important for this discussion. Now on to the gameplay. Final Fantasy VII is a turn-based RPG where you take turns hitting each other. It is exactly how it sounds. It's kinda boring like most turn-based RPGs, but to give them credit, they tried to make this game fun. This is just me not liking turn-based games that much though. I only really played this game for the story. Though, for a game released in 1997, it looks surprisingly good. In the battles. In the overworld, they tried to achieve a chibi style like other games in the past. The thing is games like Pokemon were 2D, therefore chibi style looked fine. Good even. This does not translate well into early 3D graphics. It doesn't really matter, they look stupid enough to make me laugh, so it's okay in my book. But it can take you out of some serious scenes. Overall, it's a decent game. It hasn't aged that well, but it's almost 30 years old now, so I'll give it a pass. If you want to play this game, you have a lot of options. Right now, the game is playable on all PlayStations, the Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, PC, and mobile. I would recommend you playing it on the modern versions rather than the PlayStation 1 version, because the original game can be hard to find and hard to read due to the low video quality. The modern versions fix these issues though.
Anyway, Now that we're done with that, let's talk about the other things.
Final Fantasy VII Before Crisis is a prequel game to Final Fantasy VII. It stars those Shinra Turk guys I mentioned a single time and their adventures fighting Avalanche and rogue Shinra employees. The game released on September 24th in 2004 for the FOMA mobile phone service and later released for other services in 2007. If you couldn't tell already, this is a game for Japanese flip phones. I have to assume a lot of this because the game was discontinued in 2018. It only released for those specific Japanese flip phones, only in Japan, and just straight up was only available in Japanese, making it pretty much impossible for anyone to play the official version. It doesn't really matter to me though, the game looks really bad, and the story obviously isn't that important. I've understood all of the other games up until now, and I've never even heard of this game before I made this video. Anyway, now that we got that over with, we can talk about Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. Kingdom Hearts is a series Squaresoft makes in collaboration with Final Fantasy and Disney properties. And if Final Fantasy as a whole is there, Final Fantasy VII is sure to be there too. I'm not going to talk about Kingdom Hearts itself too much here, because in all honesty, it deserves a discussion of its own. For the time being, I am just talking about the Final Fantasy VII content. Nothing more. In Kingdom Hearts 1's Traverse Town, you can meet Aerith, Yuffie, and Sid Highwind, and in the world based off of the Hercules movie, you can meet Cloud, who was dressed as Vincent for some unknown reason, and later in the game, if you revisit the world, you can fight Sephiroth, who is the hardest fight in the game. In Kingdom Hearts 2, you meet the usual suspects, but at the end, you fight Sephiroth again, who this time is way harder. Cloud shows up afterwards to fight him, and so does Tifa. In Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance, you can fight Zack, who I'll explain who he is later. And in Kingdom Hearts 3, Cloud is mentioned once at the beginning of the game, and that is the only Final Fantasy content in Kingdom Hearts 3.
Great, now that's over with.
Now let's talk about Advent Children. Advent Children is the sequel to Final Fantasy VII that released on September 14th, 2005 in the form of a movie for some reason. The fight choreography is great, and so is the cinematography, with it being one of the best parts of the movie. The story follows Cloud, who is dealing with the physical manifestations of Sephiroth trying to revive him, the guilt of his past, and a new incurable disease. It's fine, but I feel the story is a little unnecessary and juggles too many things at once, which makes it feel a little too rushed. But it's still a fine story. The movie is a favorite among many, probably because of its visual spectacle and its themes of grief resonated with people like the themes of Identity did with the original game.
A few years later, in 2009, they would release Advent Children Complete, which was an expanded and entirely better version of Advent Children, adding scenes that made more sense with the expanded content made after the original movie's release. It included bonus features, along with an anime titled Final Fantasy VII The Last Order, which is a recreation of the Nibelheim incident from the original game. It's a little difficult to talk about without getting into spoiler territory, but it's a perfect recreation of the scene from the original game, and is to this day my favorite version. A very good anime that I would highly recommend. Speaking of that, now let's talk about Crisis Core. Crisis Core is a prequel game to Final Fantasy VII starring Zack Fair, who at the beginning of the game is a soldier second class. The game manages to show the events leading up directly into Final Fantasy VII, and is great story-wise. The gameplay isn't as great though. The game was released for the PlayStation Portable, or PSP, which means they didn't get great options for controls. They tried to make this a fast-paced action game, but honestly I think it would have been better if it was turn-based, and that's coming from the resident turn-based game hater. It had a strange inventory system in battles where you would have to scroll through each green orb to find the right green orb. It would have been better if the green orbs just said what spell or attack they were, instead of me slowly scrolling through trying to find the healing spell. It's a fine game, but despite the not fun gameplay, its story is still great, and where Zack gets a lot of his character. The game got a remastered version in 2022 for every modern console known to man, and basically updated everything. It added new gameplay that makes this video game fun to play, and it only took getting rid of that stupid inventory. Remastered graphics to match up with recent games, and they updated the voice acting, which people will debate about until the end of time. Both have the same stories and the same structure, but a few key differences that make it so one person could prefer one version over the other. Both are good games though. Let's go back to 2005, when Squaresoft was doing their usual thing, making a tech demo for the new console at the time, the PlayStation 3. This time, it just so happened to be a remake of the opening of Final Fantasy VII using the PlayStation 3's hardware. And people lost their minds. Rumors began to spring up about a complete remake of Final Fantasy VII. And though at the time Square denied it, almost 10 years later,
for they are coming back. At last, the promise has been made.
you know you're iconic when you don't even have to show the title. In 2015, gameplay was revealed, and 5 years later, in 2020, the game actually released for the PlayStation 4, and a few months later got an updated version on PlayStation 5. And my god, they did it. This has to be one of the greatest games I have ever played. The combination of the best parts of turn-based combat and the action-based combat blends together so well in a way I've never seen any other games match. Visually, the game looks stunning, and the soundtrack is spectacular. But it's a three-parter. The Final Fantasy VII Remake is separated into 3 games. Over time, the game will get new parts contributing to the story, but having most of the same gameplay loop. In February of 2024, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth would release for the PlayStation 5. And well, it's more of Remake. It fixed all the small issues present in Remake and made the gameplay loop a little different. Combat feels a lot smoother, there's an actual party system, the side missions aren't bad. There is an open world style, which, yeah, it's overdone by now, but makes sense since Final Fantasy VII was the original open world game after Midgar. And if you don't like the open world stuff, you can just ignore it like I did. Overall, the game is really fun, but feels about the same as Remake for me, and I think that was the point. As for Part 3, it isn't out yet. I mean, there are some news we have from interviews, but they just boil down to they're gonna use the same model for Cloud for a 3rd time. And that is pretty much everything important. I mean, there's a whole lot more I can talk about, but there's only so much I can say about an audiobook included with Advent Children. Back to the question from the beginning. Why is it so popular? I believe it has a lot to do with the characters and the story. Each of the characters have their own struggles and problems over the course of all the stories that they learn to overcome. Each and every problem they go through, strange or not so much, has made these characters so compelling over the years. And the relatability most tend to have towards these characters and their stories is what I believe makes the compilation of Final Fantasy VII so popular. Alright, now that that's over with, I can now actually play Final Fantasy VII. Those frogs single-handedly turned me back to my original personality.